Hey, it's Mr. Barr, and today's lesson is squares and square roots. So let's get started. Our animal is a sloth, it looks like. So our learning goal, I can work with the entire real number system. Why? There are a bunch of numbers besides the number 1, 2, and 3. I want to be able to work with all of them. So this unit is about numbers. So why is this relevant? Squares and square roots are mathematical tools that are used throughout math. If you want to use the Pythagorean theorem, you've got to be able to use squares and square roots. If you want to find the standard deviation, that's a statistical method, you're going to need to use square roots. So this is a tool that is used in mathematics. So let's start with our notes. Our title for the notes is Squares and Square Roots. So our notes are going to start off with our name. So at the top of your notes, let's go with your name. And then the title today is Squares and Square Roots. And remember, if I write it, you should be writing it also. So squares and square roots, that's our title. So here's our first thing. To square a number, you multiply the number by itself. To square a number, you multiply the number by itself. So we're going to get this into our notes. So 2 squared. This is how I would say it. I'm going to say it as 2 squared, and that looks like 2 squared. That little guy right there is a second power or a square, and this really means 2 times 2, which equals 4. 2 squared equals 2 times 2, which equals 4. If at any point I'm going too fast for you with the notes, just pause the video. In math, we use a dot instead of an X to show multiplication. So you can see in my notes right here, I'm using 2 times 2. That dot represents multiplication. Any ideas why we use a dot instead of an X? Well, that's because as we get into other things, we're going to start using an X for a variable to represent an unknown. So we use a dot so it doesn't get confused with a variable. So we're going to go through the first 12 squares together. These are all going to make it into our notes. And I'm going to switch. No, I'm not going to switch to it. So let's go with, we already did 2 squared. Let's go with all of them. So we're going to go with 1 squared equals 1 times 1, which is 1. 2 squared equals 2 times 2, which is 4. 3 squared equals 3 times 3, which is 9. 4 squared equals 4 times 4, which is 16. 5 squared, which equals 10 times 10, which is, no, excuse me, 5 squared equals 5 times 5, which is 25. 6 squared, which is 6 times 6, which is 36. I'm going to come over here. We'll do 7 squared, which is 49. 7 times 7. 8 squared, 64. 9 squared, 81. 10 squared, 100. 11 squared, 11 times 11 is 121. And 12 squared, which is 144. These need to get memorized and live inside your head. These are all the nice, happy, perfect squares up to 12. Once again, if I'm going too fast, just pause the video. Square roots are backwards squares. What times itself gives you the number in the radical? So square roots are backwards squares. So now we're talking about square roots. And they are backwards squares. So we have the square root of 4. This symbol that kind of looks like a house is called a radical, or a square root. Actually, the building itself is called a radical. So the square root of 4 is 2. And that's because 2 times 2 is 4. Why? Because 2 times 2 is 4. Why is the square root of 4 2? Because two times 2 equals 4. And now we're going to do all the square roots up to 144. So we will start with the square root of 1 equals 1. Why? Because 1 times 1 equals 1. The square root of 4 equals 2. Why? Because 2 times 2 equals 4. The square root of 9 equals 3. Why? Because 3 times 3 equals 9. The square root of 16 equals 4. Why? Because 4 times 4 equals 16. The square root of 25 equals 5. Why? Because 5 times 5 equals 25. The square root of 36 equals 6. Why? Because 6 times 6 equals 36. The square root of 49 equals 7. Why? Because 7 times 7 equals 49. The square root of 64 equals 8. Why? Because 8 times 8 equals 64. The square root of 81 equals 9. The square root of 100 equals 10. The square root of 121 equals 11. And the square root of 144 equals 12. And those are all the square roots up to 12. Now we're going to look at some negative square roots. This is different from taking the square root of a negative. It's just that if there's a negative in front of it, we keep the negative. Let's get this into our notes also. Remember, if I write, you write. Negative square roots. So the square root of negative square root of 1 negative square root of 1, this is negative so that's how I would say it. Negative square root of 1, well, that's just negative 1. Negative square root of 4 equals negative 2. Negative square root of 9 equals negative 3. Negative square root of 16 equals, negative 4. So when there's a negative in front of the square root, I just take the square root and I keep the negative in front of it. This is different from taking like the square root of negative 4. We're not going to learn about that in this class. All right, well, hey, that's it for the lesson. But what we're going to do now is we're just going to do some practice problems together. So your notes are now done. So the notes for today, I was writing really big because I use a marker. But for you, I have 3 pages of notes. You probably have less than that. So your name, squares and square roots. Got all this. These are our notes for today. Our notes. And our notes. And I'm not going to do any practice problems because I didn't have any planned for today. All right, hey, thank you for watching and have a great day.